Howdy, folks. Today we are going to talk about GraphQL. We're continuing our exploration of that, and we're going to talk about queries and how do you set them up. So I've added a couple things to the system. For one, I've added a Mongoose user DB. Um, I've added a model. So we've got our user schema here. We've got our user model, and then I've added in some code that basically it looks to find everything, and if there's nothing in the database, it inserts some users to start off with. Note, this is using the promise syntax rather than the callback syntax. That's because the version of Mongoose I installed is a little bit higher than the one we've covered in class. If you ever run into that, then this is how you go with it. And then also I updated the start server so that it waits for the GraphQL server, then it waits for the Mongoose server, then it waits, then it starts the actual app. So let's just get that started right now. All right. The database is already populated, so that code didn't run. But if it wasn't populated, it would have run at this point. So back to our schema. We have our type, right? We have user, we have some stuff in it, and then we have this special query type. And this query type has users, so we can get users, and then it also has user. So this is a special little thing in here, special query, which takes a parameter. Because if we're getting users, we don't really need to parameterize them, right? We just know, oh, it's a user. We return all the users. We don't really need to filter it. But if we're getting a single user, then we need to actually have a username or some other thing associated with it. Sometimes this could be an ID as well. This would be like the parameters you pass into a GET request. So the way we do that, we have these parentheses, and then we have the name of the variable, and then we have the type. The exclamation mark here means that it cannot be null. I could put in another type here as well if I wanted to, just by separating with a comma, very similar to how you do function parameters. And this just returns a regular user. Remember, the square brackets here means that it returns an array of users, whereas this just means it returns a single user. So we've got all that in there. Let's take a look at our resolvers. So if we look at our resolvers, the resolvers are designed to be the actual implementation of the type defs. So the type defs are the menu, the resolvers are the kitchen. So in here, I've got my special type query, right? So in the resolvers, I need to have query becoming an object. There's a couple things you can put in resolvers, and that's why we have the key here. I have users, okay? And that's a query that I need to write a resolver for. All queries have to have resolvers. Users, and they can be a function. And the way these resolvers work is very similar to an Express API. Whatever you return out of this function is what gets sent up and sent as the response to your query. So users, the whole point of users is I'm returning all the users. And I have the user model in here, so I can just return user.fetch. Fetch or find? We're going to find. I think it might be find. I'm going to go with find. Actually, let me just check the model. Find. It is find. All right. So now that we've got that whole setup, we've got this function. This function will be called when the user requests, or the client requests this query. So let's open up our Apollo Sandbox here. And so the Apollo Sandbox, should have it automatically hooked up. It's going to give me all these query data. All right, so if I say users, okay, and I say, yeah, give me the username for every user. If I run that, you can see now it does exactly that. It goes in the database, gets me my users. If I say I want the age as well, it gets that. It gets this data from here. Very simple, because this just returns all those users. So now, that's how you do a very simple query. Whatever's inside this function could be as complicated as you want. In this case, it turned out to be very simple. I'm just calling the find method to get all the rows on the user Mongoose object. And then GraphQL takes that and it determines, oh, you don't care about the ID, so it just throws that away. If I want the ID and I just say don't give me anything else, it will throw away those other fields and just give me the ID. So that is what GraphQL does really well, is it kind of does that filtering on your behalf. and you just have to give it the full user object. So now we have another thing. We have user, singular, user, async. Now, this takes in a parameter. How do we get the parameter? Well, these functions can take 3 different parameters: parent, args, and context. The parent is if you're doing a nested object, which is possible in GraphQL, the parent will tell you what the parent object was in case you need to do some complicated queries to get that. The args are going to be the arguments to the query. So that's where this username is going to come from. The context is something that we'll get into a little later. So we can get rid of the context. We cannot get rid of the parent if we're going to use the arguments, because if we do, if we get rid of that parent, args now becomes the first parameter. JavaScript doesn't know that that's supposed to be the second one, so it just puts the value of parent into args, which is not what we want. So if you're trying, even if you only want to use the second parameter, you still have to put the first, just because that's how JavaScript is set up. We know that args is going to have a username. We know that because the type def says, hey, username. So this is going to be a field in the arguments object, which means I can destructure this like that. Then this is just as simple as calling mongoose, find one, username. And mongoose, again, will do a find and figure out that username. So now, let's go here, let's go back to this query, and let's pull in the next query. And I'm going to say I want all 3 fields. Notice the way this is set up now, it's got this username string and this username here. Because Apollo Sandbox knows that this query requires a parameter, that parameter is down here. So you can see I've got it set to Betty. If I run that, I get Betty. It looked up Betty by the username. If I look up Thomas, it's going to look up Thomas. So that's how you handle a query where you have a parameter on it as well. It's pretty simple. And in fact, this is very similar to how you do this in a RESTful API, right? Except that you're not getting the parameters off of the request, you're just getting them off of this. They're just right there. So the next thing that I want to go over is how we actually set this up on the client. So if I go to my client, the package you're going to need to install is also Apollo, but where on the back end we had the Apollo Server Express, the front end you're going to install Apollo at Apollo/client. You can install at Apollo/server as well if you want to. That's totally fine. That's just the later version of the server package. So we have Apollo client. To install that, you would run install at Apollo/client. I've already installed it, so I'm not going to run through it again. But there you have it. This is the package that we're going to use. So the first thing we need to do is actually hook up the client into your system. So if I go to index.js, you can do this in app, and a lot of the student activities do it in the app. I like to put providers in the index, though, just because that's how I've gotten used to things. So we're going to import the Apollo client from Apollo client. And then we're going to create a new client. Client equals new Apollo client. The first parameter is a URI, and this is the specific URI that we need to go to on our server to hit GraphQL. As our server keeps telling us, that is going to be the /GraphQL. The ports are going to be different. We'll figure out how to deal with that in a minute. Then we want a cache. Generally, you could just get away with an in-memory cache. So we're just going to say in-memory cache and cache new in-memory cache. What is the in-memory cache? Well, that's just the way that Apollo saves its data. So it can cache it and does that intelligently so that it knows, like, it doesn't make a request if it thinks it already has up-to-date data. We don't need to worry about that too much right now. So we're just going to say, hey, here's the cache. The next thing we need to do is actually set up the provider. So we import Apollo provider, and then we're going to wrap our app in that. Apollo provider client equals client. where the client is the client we just created. So I'm going to take my app, I'm going to pop that in there, and now my whole app has access to the Apollo system. So what does that mean? Well, remember what a provider does is it provides additional information or capabilities to your app, to anything that's wrapped in it. The fact that I've wrapped this at the top level means my entire application will have access to GraphQL and be able to call the queries. So let's look at how the queries are actually defined. All right. So we're going to make a new folder, utils, and then I'm going to put a queries.js inside. Similar to typedefs, we have to use a GQL function or modifier on these. So I'm going to import GQL from Apollo client. Then export const users query GQL and then the backticks. Remember, we did the same thing on the back end with the typedefs. GQL tell that. This is just the way that Apollo is set up so that it can actually compile these queries. So now how do we get our user's query? What I'm going to do is I could write it out by hand, but I'm just going to go into the sandbox here, go back up here, and I'm going to say, okay, give me my users. This is basically the query. So we're going to take that, and we're going to pop that in there, and that's our query. And that's pretty much, it's that easy. So that's why I would recommend you use the sandbox for that purpose. Next thing we got to do, let's go into our app and let's import a hook. Use query from Apollo client. Use query, this hook will only work inside something that's in the provider. But our app is inside that Apollo provider, so we should be able to utilize it. Then we're going to import our query, users query, from utils queries. Now, result equals use query, users query. There we go. Okay, now if I start this up now, run dev, this is going to, let's see what this returns. Let's actually just console log it, our result. Because there's a couple things in here that we probably want. And let's see, it starts up. I'm going to go ahead and open this up and inspect and look at our console. All right, so the first thing we get a bunch of stuff. The important things we want to look at are data, loading, and error, but I guess error isn't on here. Loading, because of how this Apollo client is set up, it basically tells us, hey, I'm loading, and here's my data. And then as soon as it's loaded, it re-renders the React system and says, now loading is false and data exists. All right. So really, if I want to destructure this, loading and data is the important part. Is it loading? Data is data. So now I've destructured those two things, and if I come back and look at this again, the first time you see, is it loading? True, data is undefined. The second time you see, is it loading? False, data is undefined. That's because there was actually an error. We got a gateway timeout. The reason for that is the proxy I'm using is a little messed up. So what is that? What do you mean? What do I mean by proxy? Well, if I look at my network tab, I can see a call to localhost 8080 GraphQL. That's what my front end is running on. The back end, however, is running on port 9090. So how's that working? How is that at all even hoping to get the right data? Well, there's a way. If you're using Create React App, you can basically go in here into your package.json and put proxy localhost and then your backend server. Mine happens to be 9090. Yours will probably be 3000 or 3001 if you used Create React App. So pay attention to that. This basically tells the system, this basically tells the webpack, any request that goes to the backend should be proxied over to here. So it's a useful way of just kind of making it magically work. Because when you're running in production, you're going to be running your client and your server on the same port. So you really do want your URI to be set up like this so that it knows to go to the same port. Then we can just put this proxy in here to make webpack know to automatically push over to the next one. Now, if you're not using Create React App, then you have to actually use something like this. You can see I basically have something very similar, dev server proxy / GraphQL proxies to this. That's how you do it if you don't have Create React App, because Create React App makes a nice little wrapper for you. So that's all set up. I think this may be working this time. Let me just run it again. All right, so now you can see, is it loading? True. Data is undefined. Then shortly after, is it loading? False. Data is, and here's the actual data from the server, users. The way you would access this is you would go in here and you would say, okay, users data.users. So what this does is this says, hey, does data exist? If so, grab the users property off of it. If it doesn't exist, then default to the empty array. That way, you know, everything just kind of works appropriately. So there's a couple other ways that you can grab queries off of the GraphQL, but this is the main way to do it. So what did we cover today? We looked at the actual query type, which is a special type that GraphQL knows to look at to get these. And these are going to be actual queries that you can run. We looked at how to add a parameter into a query. You can also do multiple parameters if you so wish. And then we looked at resolvers and how to actually set up the query and put in functions that return the data that GraphQL needs to populate the response to the client. We looked at how to handle parameters in there as well. We looked at, on the front end, what module to install, how to actually set up the client and the Apollo provider wrapper so that your app has access to GraphQL. And then we looked at how to, go in here, how to actually define the query using the GQL on your client, and then how to actually call that query using the useQuery hook. That's going to be all for now. Next time we'll go over a couple other ways to handle queries and possibly mutations. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you all next time.